Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the broadcast. This is Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy. I'm the clinical director at Evoke. So, this is something I'm really passionate about these days. I've been thinking a lot about. I think it stemmed from my reading of one of the self help books that I recently reviewed, and it's actually being reinforced by another one that I'm reading this week. This idea of resistance. What is it? What do we do that provokes it to be more intense, more of a barrier, and how can we uh, respond to it in a way that diminishes it, that helps to go around it. And the main point that I want to make tonight is that most of the easy stuff, instruction, education, tool acquisition, most of the easy stuff for all of us is not the thing that happens in therapy. The thing that happens in therapy is treating resistance, right? It is what are the things that get in the way for all of us to incorporate a new idea, to incorporate a new tool, to at a moment under stress and in crisis, being upset, anxious, why don't we do what we academically, intellectually know to do? So in other words, so many people talk about ideas, concepts, ways of thinking and approaching things and they present it as if that's the gold, that's the important thing, when in reality that's really easy to do. The hardest thing to do, really, essentially what therapy is helping people with resistance. What are the barriers to our growth? What gets in the way of us evolving, of growing, of expanding, of transformation? So I'll talk about that tonight. I'll talk about what gets in the way, how we can engage it. I'll talk about our own resistance as well as our children's resistance. So, like I said, I don't think a lot of people have an understanding about it. Therapists can often get frustrated and exasperated by a client's resistance, get upset by it. And when they do that, when a therapist does that, I guess it's true for all of us, no matter what role we're in, but it's a therapist's job to deal with it. When a therapist gets upset by it, they're not doing their job. That's the whole idea of therapy. Otherwise, we would just have psychoeducation. We could write a book on what it means to be a healthy person. And although there'd be variations in the information, a lot of people would agree on a lot of core concepts, and we would all read it and we would say, oh, okay, I'll just start living and being that way. But that's not how, as we all know, that's not how change works. That's not how we get out of our patterns that are self-sabotaging, that are problematic, that cause us and others pain and suffering. That's not how we get out of it. So resistance is something that we need to regard with great respect, that we need to understand what it is. Some examples of resistance are, and I think one of the ones that is not talked about very often is agreeing. In clinical terms, this is called introjection. Introjection is a defense mechanism where we take in new information and swallow it whole without really considering it, without really digesting it, chewing it. We defer to an authority figure in our lives or in the therapist's office, and we say, okay, well, you're saying it, therefore it must be true. Out in the wilderness, we see this kind of resistance as much as we see oppositional behavior. Especially in my group, I saw students, clients consistently agreeing with me. Staff would say, some of you have heard me say this, staff will often say when they transferred to work in my group, they would say, wow, your group is the easiest group because everybody kind of does what you say. I had a certain profile of student. Wasn't always the case, of course, but it was more consistent in my group than in other groups. But after a few weeks, few rotations in my group, those same staff would come to me and say, your group is the hardest group because everybody does what you say. And that's one of the biggest concerns that parents have when sending their children to treatment, because a lot of children have had success with looking good, with pleasing authority figures, with cooperating for short periods of time in certain contexts and circumstances. And so they worry about that, rightly so, that we're going to be impressed by that. I'm going to talk about how we and you can avoid that trapping. Sometimes it's to please, right? Sometimes it's out of shame, acceptance ideas. And sometimes it's about avoiding consequences. And I don't think we're always very good at knowing the difference in our own families with our own children because the two blend themselves pretty well. My anger, frustration, consequences, disappointment, all kind of blends together as a father, right? If I'm upset about something, about a child's behavior, there's probably going to be some kind of consequence associated with it, if nothing more than giving feedback, constructive feedback. So a child can't distinguish between, we can't distinguish between in the early phases of what's the motivation for agreeable cooperative behavior and what we call resistance in this way. Obviously, the more classic form of resistance that I think most people associate with resistance when they think about it is fighting, power struggling, non-compliance. Right? That's what most people think of when they think of resistance. And in some ways, that's some of the easiest stuff to deal with as a treatment professional. We can still engage that in ways that aren't helpful, but we don't get fooled by it. We see the child and their struggle and their block to kind of absorb this new invitation to grow, to learn, to evolve. Rationalizing, justifying, intellectualizing, right? These are ways that our mind plays tricks on us. We resist incorporating new ideas and concepts, new levels of self-awareness. All of us do some of this at times. Forgetting an appointment can be resistance. Forgetting assignments. I will tell you there was consistent themes in the assignments that I assigned to students in the field that were forgotten by that student. I always thought it was an amazing pattern out in the wilderness. The war story. The war story is an assignment where you write down as a client, as a student out in the field, something you did that was deemed inappropriate, unhealthy by people that care about you, or just common sensibly unhealthy. And you were supposed to write about it like you were bragging about it. We wanted to hear what you got out of it. What were all the benefits of the drug use, of the cutting, of the depression, of the lying, of the manipulation? How did you benefit from it? And so a lot of students did this assignment very well, got into it. And it was always really, really remarkable when, after reading the assignment in the session or going over it, and then collecting letters later in the day before I left the field for the week to give the letters to the secretaries to send to you all, that the war story somehow was missing. That's not something that a child wants a parent's eyes to see. Why I loved drugs. Why I love sexual promiscuity. Why I love lying. The power and feeling that defying my parents gave me, right? Children don't want their parents to see that. So they forget. And always, the funny thing about it is they may consciously have the experience of forgetting it. It's not like it's a intentional. There's really a difference when we talk about lying versus denial. We talk about defenses and resistance like it's all conscious sometimes. A therapist will be describing to you your child's behavior and what it means and where it comes from and what motivates it. And without making the distinction, it kind of sounds like that they're doing it on purpose when we don't really think most of it is on purpose. We think most of it is unconscious or subconscious. Avoiding, not talking, missing appointments, not doing assignments, right? Anything that looks like non-engagement. In the wilderness, we see this consistently. We see children, students, young adults not following through with assignment. Instead of sitting with the therapist or with the staff and saying, here's my struggle with it, here's why I don't want to do it, here's what's uncomfortable or difficult for me in this assignment, they just don't do it and try to pass it off as something that was unintentional. They really had the fact that I didn't do the assignment has no real meaning to that. It's just that I didn't do it. sabotaging themselves, denial, like I said. It's not necessarily a conscious, this doesn't apply to me, I don't fit here. There's so many forms, styles of resistance that I couldn't come close to naming all of them, even a large portion of them. But that gives you an idea of a handful of ones that we see more consistently. So we talk about this idea, I talk about this idea in therapy often of honoring the defense. Honoring defense in the way that I'm using it today, think of it as synonymous with resistance. Resistance is an energy that pushes you away from growth, that keeps you from growing, that prevents you from growing. And defense is the wall that you put up to keep people away from that, to block people from seeing that. And that can be a wall that stands between you and a deeper, richer version of yourself, or that can be a wall between you and other people. So there's some synonymous terms here, but they're just different aspects of the same behavior, the same dynamic. The first and foremost thing when we think about resistance and symptoms and defenses is understanding what they're trying to tell us. Now, we don't like to do that because some of these issues are scary. Some of them are life-threatening. Some of them are dangerous and damaging. And we fear that if we understand them, then we empower it. Then we give permission to continue. And that doesn't necessarily do that. It's one of those tricks that we learn as parents and as clinicians that although to lean into it, to understand it, to say that makes sense. I understand why you're acting supposedly crazy. If I was in your situation, I would be acting the same way. That's hard for us to say, but it takes away the power of the behavior. For those of you who've read my book, you'll notice that the chapter heading on behavioral change, the little quote that I put there was, before we go about trying to change the behavior, we would be best served to sometimes spend some time listening to what the behavior is trying to tell us. If we want to be more than just symptom reduction, and we do, I think, if we want to be more than just a behavioral program, behavioral programs are akin to cutting off the weed at the surface. You don't really do anything substantial. So if we want to be more than that, we have got to trace the behavior back to the wound. I had a fantastic retreat this week with a group of professionals. One of the things that I was most happy about is afterwards, one of the professionals saying, as I get ready to go home to my family, to deal with a specific issue that one of my children have, I'm much more inclined to be curious than before these 3 days. Before these 3 days, I was much more apt with my child's behavior to be anxious, to want to figure out what consequence to levy, to get rid of that behavior. And now I'm inclined to go home and be curious. And these are professionals in the field that are having this change in sensibility. So it's not our natural instinct. It's a lot of times it's not mine with my children. I get very, very caught pushing against the defense, creating greater resistance with my children because of my own human energy, right? The energy to want to fix it, the energy to want to make that unhealthy or annoying thing go away. Remaining curious is the key. Don't hold behavior change too tightly. And that means either cooperation or oppositionality. This is a key. This is a real key. The key to not engaging in behavior that's going to increase resistance, provoke it, is to pay less attention to behavior change. To really hold it lightly, to not put a lot of stock in it, whether they get well really fast or whether they struggle. It's kind of knocking off the peaks of the highs and filling up the lows of the valleys. You take a step back. And you say, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what this means. So what's it like? If we get too excited about the highs and too discouraged about the lows, we feed into it. The behavior is doing its job. It's distracting us from the pain and the wound. That's what I want to say to you. The symptom is built to prevent the child from having, or adult for that matter, from having to feel their emotions, their pain, their wound. So if we pay attention to the symptom, it wins. It's serving its purpose. So we listen to it, we don't ignore it, but we take 5 or 6 or 10 steps back and hold it really lightly. Honoring their feelings towards you. This is a hard one for all of us. I struggled with it this summer in family therapy where I had an epiphany because I saw myself both in the role as the therapist and the parent, and I realized that I was reacting the same way a lot of the parents that I've worked with have reacted to feelings and stories that the child was telling about me at the time. So it's difficult. So just listen to them, follow them, be curious about them. Don't carry them too heavy. Don't hold them too tightly. Just remain open and continue to be asking questions, honoring all of their feelings. Eventually, with structure, with support, with guidance for both you and your child, eventually things will sort themselves out. They'll come to a greater, more clear understanding of their feelings towards you and of their feelings in general. But in early stages, we've got to give them a wide berth. I don't know if I told this story recently on a broadcast. I don't think that I did. But my therapist was describing many years ago taking her son on a trip overseas to Munich, I think it was. And she described walking down the street. Her son was 13 and he was just about to get to that age in high school, right, of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so she wanted to give him some culture, some experience. She believes in that as a value that adds to our depth and richness in life. And so she brought him to Europe, and they were in Munich. And they're walking down the street. And at one point, her son was trailing behind her, and she said, "You know what? I've just about had it with you." And she went through and she listed all of he listed all of his complaints about her. And she said, I had 3 thoughts in very rapid succession. The first one is that ungrateful little jerk. I do all of this for him, and look at the things that I get. And then quickly right after that, her thought was, oh, I'm heartbroken. My son doesn't love me. And then lastly, the thought came and stayed with her that said, I couldn't have said that to my parents when I was young. And I'm glad that he can talk about it, and I want to listen. She tells me all the time that people would say to her, why do you let your son talk to you that way? And she said, I would absolutely rather him talk to me, and I'm not going to get the neatest version of it. So I give him a lot of breadth so that I can hear it. That doesn't mean you have to tolerate everything. That's not the message. The message is if we develop capacity to hear our children and their confusion and their exploration, if we don't get attached, if we can get away from those first 2 quick reactions that my therapist described, then the child is not in need of symptoms, right? They learn how to feel. Their feelings land somewhere and are held. They may be saying something crazy or acting crazy, but telling them that won't help. I don't know if you've noticed that. That goes the same in our marriage. If somebody's acting crazy, pointing it out doesn't seem to resolve the issue. Identify with the defense if you can. See how you can relate to it. Can you empathize with it? Can you find examples in your life where you've lied, where you've self-sabotaged, where you've avoided, where you've been inclined to rebel, where you've just agreed and swallowed things whole? Whatever the defense, whatever the resistance is, can you relate to it? And the better you get at that, the safer you become. That's why I talk about this over and over again all the time. The more work that you do, the more helpful you become in helping your child grow. It's that simple. So if you feel better and better, are more and more okay, have more and more capacity, that's the best thing that you can do to help to maintain long-term gains. It's not a perfection, it's not a cause and effect, but it's the biggest, clearest contribution you can make to the equation. So try to identify with it at the risk that your mind tells you that you're giving them permission. Let down yours first. Walk into meetings, do some assignments. See if you hear yourself justifying not doing some of the things that are being asked at Evoke or in other places. And there's no judgment there, because I have it too. See if you can hear some of the same themes and echoes from your excuses for not walking into an Al-Anon meeting that your child gives for not identifying as an addict. See if some of the things coming out of your mouth to explain why you don't want to go to a home therapist or a parenting therapist sound a little bit like your child's reason for not belonging in the program. These aren't my people. I don't really fit in. I can't relate. I don't need help. I could do this on my own. It won't make a difference. On and on and on. That will just help. The more, it's one of the things that I'm so grateful to be a client in therapy. Because after being a client of this therapist for 20 years and others for probably a combined 10 years, after being a client for 30 years, ongoing still, I hear clients in my session. I hear myself in clients. I can relate to it. There's very few things. I remember when I was talking to my professional colleagues this week in the intensive retreat that I was running, and it wasn't made up and it wasn't nonsense or Pollyannish. After everybody did their piece of work, I could relate. Some of the specifics were very similar. Some of them were very different, but I could relate. I could relate to those folks. Same with your children. Stay in not knowing. The more you don't know the truth, but simply your truth, the less likely you are to provoke a defense. See, if your child has to adopt, at the risk, by the way, of being rejected, if they have to adopt your truth because it's the truth, it's going to be a pretty steep climb. But that's a very different place than saying, this is what's true for me. This is what I know. This is my experience. Versus, this is the way that it is. And I know what's true for you. I was talking to a lot of the professionals this weekend, many of them in long-term recovery. And we were talking about this over and over again, that almost every story that precipitated change for them started with some kind of bottom, some kind of event that was a dead end, right? Some sort of catastrophe. Yes, we would love for everybody to avoid that, but sometimes that's the way to change. Short of dying or serving a life sentence, all the other rest of the things are fairly redeemable, right? People can figure them out. It doesn't mean laissez-faire parenting. It just means having a perspective that doesn't cause us to be angry and controlling. We still have assertive boundaries, but not from an anxious, controlling place, a fearful place. And honoring the defenses, honoring the resistance, understanding it does not mean no boundaries. They just come from a different place. They come from self-care. When I was working in the field this summer, covering for my partner while he was on sabbatical, I practiced as much as I could what I'm teaching here tonight, to honor and respect all the behaviors that the students were presenting with, both before the program and in the program. And at the same time, I had very clear boundaries and consequences for them. But it wasn't layered under judgment and threat and intimidation and fear. It was just kind of pragmatic, matter of fact. And because I didn't layer on all that other stuff, all that other kind of attacking energy, There was no reason for the defense to increase or refortify. That's what defenses do. When defenses are threatened, like I always say, you approach a child, or anybody for that matter, where they've built a wall around them to protect themselves from perceived threats, and you start walking up and you have a jackhammer and a pickaxe in your hand, they're only going to fortify it. So you lay down your tools. You lay down your crowbar. You don't try to pry them open, but you try to model it. You take off your armor. You lower your defense. And if your armor is gone and your tools for dismembering their wall is gone, you're less of a threat. And then they start taking down the bricks that make up their wall one by one. Most parents, I shouldn't have said most parents. I should have said most people. But I'm speaking to parents. So most parents believe that the key is about guidance and offering wisdom. That's really the easy stuff. Just think about it in your life. Advice is easy, dime a dozen, right? That's why we say my 2 cents, because that's about how much it's worth. The real key is to find them, to see them, to understand that the defense is doing work. Great quote from a book, Inadequate Therapists and Cruel People both have a tendency to strip away somebody's armor, somebody's defense, but without recognizing the cost. The defense is doing important work. The resistance is doing important work to protect them. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending so much energy on them. Understand that. And by the way, I want to be as clear as I can. This is how you support and facilitate and encourage change. It's counterintuitive. It looks like it's going in the opposite direction, but this is how you do it. Lecturing, teaching, preaching, advice, all likely to reinforce and provoke defenses, and they understand the information anyway. They don't need more information. It takes them about 2 weeks before they become experts at the new guys, right? The new folks coming into the group, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in, they're experts, telling the other ones what they should do. They turn into junior therapists and parents. I used to use this experiment where when a child was feigning stupidity. I don't understand why I can't go home. I don't understand why I can't call my boyfriend or my girlfriend. I realized there was no answer I could give where they would say, oh, thanks for the information. Now that makes sense. Now I'll sit patiently with that boundary. I would say to them, I'll give you a pound of M&Ms, one of those big bags of M&Ms, if you can tell me the answer to the question, a reasonable answer to the question. And before I could finish that sentence, because sugar is not something that's common out there, it's very rare, they were giving me a dissertation on why they can't go home, why they can't call their significant other, the answer to any why. They don't, it's not the information. It's not that hard. Most of the basic stuff about living a decent life isn't that complicated. It's the stuff that gets in the way of us knowing it, seeing it, internalizing it, and living it. That's the hard stuff. Why doesn't mean why most of the time. Why is usually an invitation from a child to a parent for a battle. I just had this discussion with one of my children at dinner this evening where she said, why? And I said, I'm just not going to talk about that. Or I'll say, just my gut, just how I feel. It happened again this morning. We were driving to school and she said, can I play this song? And I said, I don't want to play that song from that artist. And she said, why? And I said, just not comfortable. No great reason. Even with that, she tried to give me a counter argument. I just said, I'm just kind of crazy and neurotic that way, right? There's no reasoning with a drunk. Reflective listening can help because it just leaves it with them. I remember, I haven't told this story in years. I remember one of my professors, my favorite professor. in my graduate program, my second graduate program. She was, I had a class where I think it was about supervision, where we would all bring cases in and then we would discuss it. 2.5 hour class on Monday night. And she was late every week. Sometimes she was 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. This particular evening, she was a half an hour late. So the 8 or 9 of us that are sitting there in class are getting frustrated and complaining. Of course, in my role in my life, I volunteered and was elected to be the one to confront her when she came. So when she came, I just expressed my disappointment and frustration. And she said, I bet you do feel that way. And it just hit me. I thought, yeah, that's my feeling. She didn't take it on. She just gave it right back to me. I could have dropped the class and she would have let me. I could have complained to the dean, filed a complaint with the university. I could have done any of that. Or I could just share my feeling and deal with it. Sharing from the I perspective. This is something, I want you to try to pay attention to when you're talking about yourself. Do you talk in the second person? And this is what that sounds like. When you're tired and you're exhausted at the end of the day and you come home and your children have all these needs and you're frustrated and you snap at them. That's how it sounds in the second person. And many of us talk that way. But when we talk in the first person, it sounds like this. When I come home at the end of the day and I'm exhausted and I'm drained and my children start complaining and I snap at them, there's a different feeling between those two, right? The first one is impersonal and distant. And the first one is intimate and vulnerable. I'm owning it. Just changing to I makes a difference. And there's a reason why we don't use I. Sometimes people think it's self-centered to talk about it, but why would it be self-centered to talk about something where you're talking about your own fallibility, your own mistakes? So I don't buy that it's always that. A lot of times we just don't want to own it. We want to keep it 6 feet away from us. We want to keep ourselves distant from the issue. We want it to be an intellectual issue. It's that old cliche where you're going to the therapist and you're asking about an issue that a friend has. Right? That's the third person. There's this idea that a famous psychologist gave one time. He called it pseudo stupidity. And he basically explained that a lack of understanding is not a cognitive limitation, but it's an emotional one. I've said this before. My therapist said things to me the first 5 or 10 years of therapy that didn't quite hit me right. At times I just thought, I don't get it, or she doesn't get it, or no, that's not right. That now, today, are absolutely obvious to me. I didn't get smarter intellectually, not really. I was plenty intelligent 10 years ago, 15 years ago to understand it. But something in me had to grow. Something in me had to die. I had to let go of some things and gain some things, and now I can hear it. A very classic one is asking people to look at their childhood, their family of origin, the relationships. Many people will say that there wasn't a lot there, or it was pretty good. I had a pretty happy childhood. And you don't want to say as a therapist, well, keep looking. Right? You say that, you're going to lose the client. But you can find it. And I've said this. I love my mother more now today than I did 30 years ago. By far. And I have a much greater awareness of her limitations today than I did 30 years ago. I'm much more clear about how she's compromised. So it's not this lack of love and blame. It's just an awareness that we have some investment in hiding from ourselves. We've been enrolled, most likely, in that particular example. We've been enrolled in this idea of protecting. We've been told that to think about somebody else's impact on us is to abdicate responsibility, is to blame somebody else and not take responsibility. That's not true. It can absolutely be my responsibility and I can still see the origin. I could be abused by somebody. And that's their issue. But the minute that I'm abused by them, it's now mine and my responsibility to deal with. So those false dichotomies get in the way. But they're psychologically rooted more than they are intellectually. Engaging the defenses, try to take the shame, the judgment out of it. Think about it pragmatically. I mean, that's really what therapists think about. That's what I think about. That's what we find to be effective. It's not ideological. It's just, I don't think it works. I used to say, if smoking crack worked and helped you to be happy and have a meaningful and rich and productive life with wonderful relationships, I'd be handing that stuff out. If getting aggressive and yelling at people led to healthy relationships and happiness and joy, I'd give you a lesson on how to yell at somebody better. It just doesn't work. And so think about what works with our children. You can stand on the pedestal of righteousness and you can say, I know right and wrong. I believe in right and wrong. I think it's universal. You can do that if you like. You're welcome to that. I can't talk you out of that. Taking that position does not help you get to where you want to go with your child, just practically speaking. It tends to provoke and engage and fortify defenses. We'll get there, but not in the vehicle, not in the way, not on the path that you think. I talk about Trojan horse parenting. This idea that you send your child to us to fix them, right? That makes sense. They have mental health issues and addiction issues, and some of them are very destructive. Virtually all of them are leading to problems in their life that are causing more and more pain and suffering for everybody. All of that's true. But when you arrive, that's the gift. The gift is we're going to work on your child, and we think we're really effective at it. The research shows that we are. But then when you get here, we're going to kind of get out of the horse, get out of the gift, and we're going to kind of surround you and give you support, give you ideas. And then this process becomes something different than you imagined it to be. And most of the people that show up to these broadcasts and listen to these podcasts will tell everybody that they know, I loved the program, but most importantly, it changed me. And with my new eyes, my new ears, my new ability, the new words that come out of my mouth, I'm at peace from the get-go. Even if nothing about my child changes, I have greater peace and serenity, clarity, confidence. And I also now know how to engage my child and everybody I know in a way that makes more sense than what I was taught, how I was taught. Because most of us weren't taught how to be in relationship to other people. We were taught how to, but we weren't taught the proper way to be in relationship to other people. We were taught control and fear. We were taught overlapping boundaries, enmeshment. We were taught that to love a child is to consume them, right? To love a child is to see our reflection in their eyes. To love a child is to take on their successes and failures as ours. That's what we were taught. It was modeled for us. Sharing your vulnerability. I would say this all the time out in the field. I would talk about this idea where people would complain about it not feeling safe, and I'd say the best way to get it safe is for you to start. We just did, like I said, a professional retreat this weekend. And first person goes with the big piece of work and shares vulnerably, everybody's defenses were down. My defense was lowered by the first person who shared. The first check-in on the first night. I was like, oh, so we can be honest. Even as a facilitator, I can talk about that. That's okay. Shame is a part of the defense, right? Shame is hiding. Shame, in essence, is the experience of wanting to disappear, believing that I deserve to disappear, to not be seen. It's the urge to shrink, the urge to not be seen, not be looked upon as repulsive, strange, crazy, broken, damaged, right? Anything that's going to repel people and leave me alone in the world. So I just want to go away. As a child, burdening my parents with my mental health and addiction issues because they're loving people and they've done more for me, unarguably, than anybody else on the planet. And after all I've done for them, and I've lied over and over and over again, feels like I have no choice but to retreat, to hide, to distance myself from them. Learning to not win, learning to not be right is the key, right? But the foundation of not winning and not being right is feeling good about yourself. People that feel good about themselves, they can be wrong. People that don't feel as good about themselves, they need to be right. I know because I do both. Trying to prove to them. I've spent my fair share of time in conversation with my family, trying to prove to people, trying to prove to my children. The younger, more the older children, excuse me, when they were younger, much more so than today. But I'm still inclined to fall into that trap now and again. The barriers are fear, anger, control. Those are the barriers to connection. Those are the barriers to relationship. Shame, of course, is a barrier. Our own shame. Red light language. That's a term that a therapist shared with me a couple of decades ago about things that tend to shut down communication. Black and white, all or nothing, catastrophizing. It's one of the 8 tools, actually. Avoiding polarizations, avoiding advice giving. Imperatives is right. You have to, you need to, you should, you ought to. Absolute, like this is the absolute truth. I know it. I know not just my truth. I know all truth, and I know your truth. Moralizing with your children, right? That's how you changed. That's how you experience your awakening, your develop of conscience, of morality. So you simply impose that onto somebody else. Give it to them. Over identifying with our children. Like I said, seeing, looking in their eyes, looking in their face, looking in their work, their accomplishments, their failures, their struggles, and seeing us. That's over identifying. Feeling their pain for them. Parental resistance. What's our resistance? What does it feel like when a therapist engages the defense? Well, when a therapist engages the defense, what it feels like is the therapist doesn't understand me. That's what I described earlier with my therapist. Things that I thought the first 10 years were not quite right on, observations she had, ideas that she had. She wasn't perfect by any means. But by and large, most of the things that she said, the big ones that stand out, I sit here today and I'm like, yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. I remember early on, she used to say things about my mother. Said this last week, and I'm like, we haven't talked about my mother that much, or my father. But she'd heard enough to know. Or I would describe somebody and she would say, this is what's going on with that person. I'd say, how do you know that? I only told you 2 or 3 things about them. Gosh, you're taking leaps, I thought. And now I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty clear. It's not that hard to see because of my own growth. How does it feel to have the focus on you? How does that feel? Is it hard? You know, when I was in family therapy this summer, I was surprised that it was more difficult than I thought it was, given what I know to be true and what I teach, but I still have my own resistance. Seeing how different your situation is. I hear this all the time. Well, I don't have a teenager. I have a young adult. My child doesn't do drugs, so I don't really need to go to Al-Anon because my child's on the spectrum. My child doesn't act out. My child turns the anger inward or cuts on themselves. So my child doesn't really do that. When you get a few layers deep, it's all the same. There are, of course, in the extremities, in the branches, the small brushstrokes, there are differences. But the human condition is what we're talking about here. What's it like to be in a relationship with other? Right? It's that quote that I share all the time from Gandhi: if we love other as other, if we love other as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility for our own individuation and our own journey. If we have regarded our own inner child, that means kind of our core issues, our primary traumas, attachment wounds, our primary themes in life. If we have regarded those things with compassion, understanding, if we hold our own depression and anxiety like we would a young child, and we pay attention to them and we listen to what they have to tell us, we will be able to do that with our children. It's an inextricable connection. The extent that you're able to look at your inner child, to look at your history, to look at your themes and your wounds, is the extent to which you're capable of loving your child other as other, holding them. And there's virtually no separation between those two abilities and two capacities. That's what Gandhi meant when he said, if we love other as other, we've taken on the responsibility of our own differentiation, of our own journey. So difference is an illusion. I can walk into an AA meeting, an NA meeting, an Al-Anon meeting, an adult child of an alcoholic, and I can say, yeah, my circumstances are different, but I can relate. Alcohol is not my drug of choice, but I can relate. Yes, I don't lie as often as you do, but I know what it's like to not want to tell the truth. I know the risk involved in that challenge. Seeking advice about what to do then rather than understanding and thinking about the dynamics of the situation, right? It's really hard to answer the question, what do you want? What do I do? Because I don't know what you do. Do what you want. Just think about it. Just kind of take a deeper look at it. I can't tell you to kick your child out of the house. I can't tell you to let them back in. I can explore what's in it for you. What's going on for you? Where did that come from? Where's that theme? Where's that fear come from originally? Where's that belief come from originally? Then getting a lay of the landscape, then you can make the decision that you want, but I can't tell you what to do. The best thing for you may be to make the exact opposite decision that I think I would make, or that I would make. Symptom focus, it's really hard, like I said, not to be symptom focused as a parent. I'm much better at it, but not perfect by any means as a therapist than I am as a parent. Owning your own shame. We all don't have the same amount, but we all have some. We all have some. Owning your part of it. You have something to do with the resistance. If you remember, I said this last year, my wife, when our son went on a wilderness trek this summer. My wife wrote in the hopes and intentions letter, she said, it's not lost on me that the things that you're doing that we're asking you to get rid of, the symptoms that you have that we're asking you to work on, were put there in part to protect yourself from us and the things that we've done to you or not done for you. And I thought that was an enormously generous statement by my wife. So owning your part. Melanie Klein is a famous developmental psychologist who talks about two positions. The original position as young children is called the paranoid position. That is, the problem is out there, the threat is out there, evil is out there. The depressed position is the second stage of life, and it can come at varying times. For some people, it never comes, which is the problem is in here, in me. My belief about it, my relationship to it, the stigma I attach to it. I was reading a book by Brene Brown this week, and she was talking about failure. And as I was reading, I was like, It's not failure. It's not innately what failure is. It's what failure means to me, right? So learning to take it in, learning to take it in as ours, our contribution. Going to meetings, looking at yourself, being right. What resistance do you have to that? Where do you show up? Talk about that. Visit that. Spend time with that. It'll make you more capable as a parent. So what are the take homes? Communication skills can help. Remember the 8 tools? I just did it last week. Um, it helps in two ways. It helps with the dynamic between yourself and other, right? It changes the engagement with the defense. It doesn't tend to provoke it. It's not red light language. So it helps with the dynamic. But maybe most importantly, what it also does is it helps you to think differently about what it means to be in relationship to another human being. I listed on here 2 other webinars that build on and relate to this. One is the 8 tools, which I've already mentioned. The other one is motivational interviewing, informed parenting, from the book Motivational Interviewing. So those also talk about, and motivational interviewing is full of pages and pages of research citations to show the concepts that to engage the defense straight on, to confront it, to challenge it, does not work as effectively as what we're talking about today. Let them feel, think, and believe what they want. Just have a boundary, right? But most of us want to convince them to feel and think differently because here's the trick. If I can get them to feel differently and think differently, then they'll behave differently, then I don't have to set a boundary, which has with it a whole bunch of stuff, fears, anxieties, insecurities for me. Attachment trumps most everything. Being a healthy container for the child, it kind of, in the hierarchy of contributions we can make to our children, it's kind of the most important by a long shot. It leads to healthy boundaries. It leads to a gentler inner voice for our child. It leads to less shame. It contributes to all of those things in a powerful way. Look at the webinar on attachment that I did recently, where I talk about ways to respond in healthy attachment ways, secure attachment ways. Separate boundaries and limits from emotional messages. Boundaries are about you taking care of your self-care, right? I'm not comfortable with you going out. I'm not comfortable with you playing that song this morning. I'm not comfortable with you coming home yet after wilderness. It's about you. It's a great model. It's a vulnerable place. For some reason, as parents, we don't think in that way. We imagine that we have to be this altruistic, selfless, nothing, only in service of feeding our child and their life, instead of I can have a self. In fact, having a self is critical. Focusing on outcomes is a problem. Remember, you can't win. You can insert in there control. You can't win, but you can choose how to lose. So we try to show up more and more as an honest, authentic person. Take care of yourself. So first you can respond with compassion to your child instead of fear and anger. And so your child doesn't have to take care of you. See, if you take care of you, if your answer to the question is, I can't do that, innately, inherently, your child knows, I mean, what they'll tell you is something like, well, that's not fair. But that's just noise. That word doesn't mean anything. What they really are saying is, I don't like it, or I'm pissed, or screw you. It means something like that, really. Or let's have a good debate about it, because I'm better than you at debating, or at least I'm more relentless. But when you say, I'm not comfortable doing that, and I can't and feel okay, and I'm not willing to do this, and I'm not willing to have you here under these conditions, when we start to talk like that, it's different. It's unassailable. It's modeling what self is. Be with them on the journey. Make your life your project. Get away from making their life your project and make your life your project. Make it your priority. so that when you are with the child, it's for them and not for you. You take care of yourself so that when you're with them, you can be there for them instead of them needing to fit some way, to behave some way, so that you feel okay. That's the key. All right, I have some questions. I don't have a moderator this evening, so what are the titles of the self-help books you mentioned that are the foundation of this topic? They weren't the foundation. They were the ones that made me think people don't get it. The one, The Subtle Art of Not Giving Enough, if you remember that. That made me think there's some good concepts in there, especially the first third of it, but he was just telling you to think differently. And then the other one is Brene Brown that I'm reading right now, and Brene's famous, right? She's a great inspirational storyteller. She's also very shaming, actually. She doesn't know this, and nobody ever says this, but she gets very insulting at people's mental health issues. I was listening to the book today, and she was talking about people in the cheap seats. She was insulting people that had mental health issues. And then she was raving about people who were overcoming them. And it was really intense. And I was thinking, that's not the way you help people that are hurting. You don't insult them and call them names. But nobody ever notices that she does that. Another comment: the story about the professor being late feels to me like she dismissed you when you shared your feeling, unwilling to be accountable to a boundary you were attempting to make. Had you not described your frustration as a feeling, might have been better. Not giving her the option of just handing it back to you. The entire class is put out by her lack of respect for her time. Something is wrong with her response for me. I thought that too at the time. I could have done something about it. I didn't, and I don't felt like I compromised myself. It's just she, to this day, was the most important and is the most important person in my formal education by far. And I kind of took what she gave me. And yes, I wanted her to show up on time. She was never that late again, but I've known her for, what has it been now, 30 years. And she was late. She's been late more than most people. It's one of her issues for sure. And I get to choose if I want to be in a relationship with that or not. Another parent says, can my child still do well after coming home if only one parent at home participates in personal therapy, 12-step meetings, webinars, etc.? You know, it's like fighting one hand. It's like fighting a fight with one hand tied behind your back. You can win, but it's harder. And the research shows that children don't need two people in their life. It's better if they do. It's just simply that way. It's better if they do, but it's not ideal. So don't give up. Keep doing your work. Not all is lost. You can make a difference, but it's going to be a little bit more of a heavy load for you to carry. And then someone says, which Brene Brown book are you listening to? I'm listening to Rising Strong actually right now. And I do like Brene Brown because she is inspirational for a lot of people. But she's not a therapist. She's a social scientist. She's a researcher and a storyteller. And the problem about that is she doesn't people that are telling their story don't know why they have grit and resiliency, right? And sitting in offices with young people or clients or couples over decades, you start to learn. It's your job to learn what's happening there. And people sometimes don't know what's happening, why it's changing. So sometimes the way that she talks, she misses some pieces. And people think she's a psychologist or a therapist. She's got great ideas and she's got some great quotes, but there's a piece missing there that she doesn't quite get. One of the pieces I talk about in my book where she makes a comment about guilt that makes no sense whatsoever in one of her two famous TED Talks about how guilt is associated with mentally healthy people. And that's just not true. So it's different than therapy. Even Alice Miller, who is a phenomenal psychologist, or she might be a psychiatrist actually, who wrote the drama The Gifted Child. I think the most important book in child development of all time. Even she says about her own book, don't mistake this for therapy. And she's right. I love that book when I read it. The same professor that was late gave it to me when I was in college, and it changed my life. It's been the most impactful idea in my life, but it wasn't therapy. That's taken a couple of decades. Another parent asks, how do I reconcile the attachment is paramount with my own fear and inability to listen to my daughter talk about suicide and self-harm without feeling overwhelming anxiety myself? That's a perfect question. You go talk to somebody else about that. You need somebody that you can talk to about your anxiety, that they can hold that. So when you show up, you're less anxious. I know that sounds kind of simple, but if you're just, I'm just saying this for illustration purposes. If you're talking to your therapist about that a lot, if you're dumping that on them, giving that over to them, and they're listening and providing you an empathic experience, hopefully they are. Then when you come back to your daughter, you have a full belly spiritually, emotionally, and you can be there for her and respond to her in ways that help her, not you, because the anxiety that happens in those moments is yours. And you're inclined unconsciously to get her to not be suicidal so you don't feel anxious. So you go take care of your anxiety, which is well deserved, well earned, absolutely natural, and part of your instinct. You take care of that somewhere else. So when you're having a conversation with her, you are there for her. And she doesn't have to be there for you. I always say this. If a child comes to you sharing a thought, an idea, a suicidal ideation, and your response is to gasp like, and that's exaggerated to illustrate, the first thing that they know is you're not safe. Now they think they got to take care of you. When your children tell me that they're suicidal, it causes me anxiety, but I'm much more able to respond to it because of the work that I do. Because they're not my child, for one, because of the work that I do, the awareness I have, even with my own children. I'm better at dealing with symptoms than I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because I do my own work. To love other, as Gandhi says, is to heroically take on the responsibility for your own differentiation and your own journey. And this capacity is called love. All right, folks, you can send in more questions if you want while I go through the upcoming announcements. We strongly encourage and invite all parents to attend 6 12-step support groups. We include a few. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous. Alateen is for teens. Adultchildren.org is where you can find adult children of alcoholics. It's a great, if you had an unhealthy childhood that you're aware of, it's a great place to start. Even if you didn't, it'd be a great place to learn what it was like or how you might have. RefugeRecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less emphasis on a higher power. NAMI.org, that's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, can have free classes and resources in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app, on your iPhone, or the SoundCloud app on your Android device by just searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also go online to soundcloud.com and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Please rate us. Please go to your podcast app and rate us. It really helps us and share. We think it's a great resource. On Twitter and Instagram, you can follow us at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. The Family Foundation, a foundation founded by alumni parents that helps people that can't afford therapy. You can find that on Facebook by searching Evoke Family Foundation. Evoke Therapy also has a blog with updated content. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available in paperback. I'll just click the button underneath the paperback tab where it says 7 new options for $14.95 while it's being reprinted. You can buy it direct from Evoke. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, this is something I do every year, something I believe in, something my children have done, my wife has done. Come to one of our intensives. We call ours Finding You. The next one is March 27th through 31st. Upcoming parent support groups, I'll be in California this Sunday, the 24th at noon to 3. The first hour is a potluck. If you're in Southern California, please come. It's a wonderful community, wonderful discussion. We're actually going to be discussing Rising Strong by Brene Brown this week, and then I'm going to do a webinar on it next week. Email Melanie at evoketherapy.com to RSVP or for more information for the address. Uh, I'll be in the Bay Area on the 28th, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. That's at the San Francisco Marriott Airport. And then I'll be in New York on March 18th. We ask all current parents to come to a workshop, 2-day experiential workshop if they can, multifamily, psychoeducational, experiential. You can combine that with a visit to see your child if the timing is right, according to your Evoke therapist. March 23rd and 24th at our Southern Utah program is our next opportunity. Melanie at evoketherapy.com for information or to RSVP. Our pursuits trips are for young adults and families. Think therapy light, think reconnecting to your work. It's adventure, customized all over the world, any kind of activity. Somebody asked, is there a morning meditation at the Summit Lodge? There is. The morning meditation is every Monday morning, 6:30 Central, and it goes for 24 hours. So I forgot to list that. We also have a new Instagram account for the Summit Lodge. It's just Evoke Summit Lodge, and so it broadcasts live in the morning. That's 6:30 Central Time, and then it plays for 24 hours if that's too early for you and for your time zone. Another parent says, I so enjoy advising and data sharing. It's so hard to stop, particularly since it sometimes works well with my son. He listens and follows the advice, and often regarding subjects I am knowledgeable about, and he is not. It still feels manipulative. Is there a way to share information that is honest and not simply outcome oriented? I like to advise in some areas, such as education and careers. Is that acceptable? Um, the difficult part is it solves problems temporarily, but it doesn't encourage the development of self. There is in one of the 8 tips, one of the 8 tools that I talk about on that broadcast, there is a way to talk about it where you say, I have a thought, I have an idea, here's my experience. It may not work for you. It's true for me, but it's not necessarily true for you. You can talk about it that way. That's not advice giving, that's just sharing your experience. And of course, checking it out with the other person to see if they're open to it instead of just steamrolling over it. So that's as close as you really want to get to advice. I don't know when my second book, someone asked, when's your second book coming out? I don't know. My publisher's in charge of that, but I'm really excited about it. And I'm more excited about it than the first one, actually. Really looking forward to it, really enjoying it. And hopefully it'll be out sometime this year. And I will for sure give you the announcements on that. All right, folks, thanks for joining us for and on behalf of your children. I appreciate and respect you showing up here. I hope these points of contact are helpful. If you listen to them afterwards on the podcast, I hope it helps you to keep connected to the work. Have a great week and, excuse me, have a great 24 hours. The next broadcast is tomorrow night. That's not what it's about. It's not about rising strong. Tomorrow night I'm going to be talking about, I don't know what I'm going to be talking about. I put up the wrong slide, but it's 7:10 p.m. 7:10 p.m. Mountain Time tomorrow night, the 21st. So we'll send out an announcement first thing in the morning. Take care, folks. Talk to you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.